Riley Mitchell stared at $75,000 in cash, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. One phone call could change everything or destroy her. She didn't know the money was a test. She didn't know the man who left it was watching. And she had no idea that her choice in this moment would bind her forever to the most dangerous man in Chicago. This is how one act of honesty sealed her fate. Before we dive into Riley and Alexander's emotional journey, if you love dramatic romance stories packed with unexpected twists, real human struggle, and powerful redemption, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Hit that like button if you're ready for this emotional ride. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. And share this video with someone who believes in second chances and the power of love to transform even the darkest hearts. Now, let's get into how one choice made in a moment of desperate temptation changed two lives forever. The discovery, the temptation, and the test. Riley Mitchell was 26 years old and running on fumes. She worked 12-hour shifts as a certified paramedic for the Chicago Fire Department, racing through the city's chaotic streets, responding to overdoses, shootings, car accidents, and cardiac arrests that painted her days in shades of blood and desperation. The work was brutal, emotionally draining, and the pay barely covered her rent in a cramped studio apartment on the South Side, where sirens wailed through thin walls at all hours. Then, 3 nights a week, she pulled on a stained apron and worked the graveyard shift at Stella's Diner, serving burnt coffee and greasy eggs to insomniacs, drunks, an occasional lonely soul looking for human connection at 2 a.m. She was saving every possible dollar for a dream, a full MD in trauma surgery, the chance to lead surgical teams and make life-or-death decisions in sterile operating rooms instead of the backs of speeding ambulances. Her paramedic certification had cost her thousands in student loans, and the part-time pre-med courses at Chicago City College were bleeding her bank account dry with textbooks that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Her natural dark curls were always pulled back in a practical bun, her warm brown eyes constantly shadowed with exhaustion that no amount of coffee could chase away. But her smile, though tired and worn thin by endless shifts, still had genuine kindness in it. She dreamed of the day she'd trade her ambulance uniform for surgical scrubs in a real hospital operating room, saving lives with her own skilled hands and hard-earned medical knowledge. But that dream felt impossibly distant, buried under a mountain of debt, bone-deep exhaustion, and the relentless grind of survival that consumed every waking moment of her existence. It was 1:45 in the morning on a quiet Friday night, and Stella's Diner was winding down to empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects. Riley was wiping down the cracked Formica counter with a worn dish rag, her mind already running to the pharmacology flashcards she needed to memorize before her Saturday morning exam on drug interactions and contraindications. She glanced toward booth 7 near the back corner by the restrooms, observing the man who had been her final customer tonight with a mixture of professional courtesy and instinctive wariness. He was striking in a deeply unsettling way. Late 30s, probably 38 or 39, with sharp, almost sculpted features that looked carved from stone, dark hair swept back with perfect precision that suggested expensive styling, and cold gray eyes that seemed to catalog and assess everything and everyone in the room with the systematic efficiency of a predator calculating distances and vulnerabilities. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that looked custom-tailored to his broad shoulders and lean frame, the kind of clothing that cost more than Riley made in 3 months of double shifts, completely out of place in the greasy, neon-lit atmosphere of Stella's Diner, where most customers wore construction boots and faded work shirts. He had ordered only a club soda with lime nearly an hour ago, never touched the lime wedge that floated in the glass like a small green boat, and sat in complete, heavy silence that seemed to press against the walls, his present oppressive weight in the usually casual, breezy space where tired workers traded jokes and complaints. When he finally stood to leave around 1:30, moving with liquid grace that suggested either military training or something more dangerous, he paid with a single crisp $100 bill that looked freshly printed, declined all change without a word or even a glance at Riley, and walked out with movements that were precise, controlled, almost predatory in their efficiency. He was the kind of man who left a wake of uncomfortable silence rather than conversation, and Riley had seen enough dangerous people in her 4 years as a paramedic: gang members with bullet wounds, domestic abusers with split knuckles, drug dealers with dead eyes, to recognize truly lethal energy when she felt it radiating from someone like heat from asphalt. As Riley began clearing Booth 7, wiping away the ring of condensation from the abandoned glass and checking for forgotten items, as she'd been trained to do, her hand swept across the cracked red vinyl seat that had been repaired multiple times with duct tape. Her fingers brushed against something solid, substantial, and unexpectedly heavy wedged deep between the seat cushion and the wall, stuck in that narrow space where things disappeared and were rarely recovered. She tugged it free with some effort and stared down in genuine surprise. It was a black leather medical bag. Not a cheap drugstore first aid kit with cartoon bandages, but a professional-grade emergency response bag made of rich, supple leather with reinforced stitching at every seam, heavy-duty brass zippers that gleamed under the diner's harsh lights, and a structured interior that spoke of serious purpose and significant expense. The bag was compact but dense with weight when she lifted it, clearly expensive in a way that announced itself quietly through quality rather than logos, and completely out of place in the worn-out booth of a South Side diner, where most customers carried their belongings in plastic grocery bags or battered backpacks. Riley's paramedic instincts kicked in immediately, overriding her exhaustion. Her heart began to pound with a mixture of professional concern and personal curiosity that made her palms sweat. Medical bags like this didn't get left behind accidentally. They were too valuable, too important, too essential to whoever owned them. Someone might desperately need this equipment for an emergency, might be searching frantically for it right now, might have a patient somewhere who required immediate care. She glanced around the empty diner to make sure no one was watching through the plate glass windows, then carefully unzipped the main compartment with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to handle medical emergencies without panic, her trained hands moving with deliberate caution. What she found inside made her breath catch sharply in her throat. Her pulse spiked with a confusing mixture of shock, fear, and overwhelming temptation that made her hands start trembling. Inside the medical kit was an immaculate array of professional equipment that Riley recognized instantly from her years working trauma scenes in Chicago's most violent neighborhoods. Sterile surgical instruments still sealed in medical-grade packaging with expiration dates printed in small type. Scalpels with various blade sizes from delicate to aggressive. Curved hemostats for clamping blood vessels. Needle drivers for precise suturing. Surgical scissors with razor-sharp edges. And a set of precision forceps that gleamed silver under the diner lights. For supplies including multiple gauge catheters ranging from 18 to 22 gauge for different vessel sizes, coiled extension tubing, saline flush syringes, alcohol prep pads, and 3 full bags of normal saline for fluid resuscitation. Prescription medications in pharmaceutical packaging with printed labels and lot numbers, broad-spectrum antibiotics including ceftriaxone and azithromycin, injectable pain management drugs, including morphine sulfate and fentanyl citrate, that required DA licensing to possess legally, sedatives like midazolam for chemical restraint, and multiple epinephrine auto-injectors for anaphylaxis or cardiac arrest. Everything was organized with almost military precision in custom-cut foam inserts that held each item in its designated place, suggesting someone who understood emergency medicine and valued preparation above all else. But what made Riley's hands start trembling violently, what made her breath come faster and her heart hammer against her ribs, was nestled in the center compartment with almost ceremonial prominence. A medical-grade blood bag with clear professional labeling that read in black letters, A. Wolfe, AB negative, universal plasma donor, with a recent collection date from 2 weeks ago, and beneath that blood bag, stacked in neat bundles held together by an engraved silver money clip that caught the light, with $75,000 in sequential $100 bills that smelled faintly of ink and represented more money than Riley had ever seen in her entire life. She stared at the cash, her exhausted mind struggling to process the amount, her fingers hovering over the bills but not quite touching them as if they might burn her skin. $75,000. That was 2 full years of medical school tuition paid in advance, without loans or interest. That was rent and groceries covered for years without the constant anxiety of eviction notices. That was a reliable car to replace the brutal late-night bus rides through dangerous neighborhoods where she'd been followed more than once. That was freedom from the suffocating weight of poverty and endless exhaustion that made her body ache and her mind fog with desperation. Riley sank onto the vinyl booth seat, still clutching the open medical bag in her lap. Like it might disappear as she set it down, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it pulsing in her throat and temples. $75,000. The number echoed in her exhausted mind like a siren song, like a salvation hymn, like the answer to every desperate prayer she'd whispered into her pillow after 18-hour days. She let herself imagine it fully, gave herself permission to visualize the fantasy in vivid detail. Walking into the Chicago City College bursar's office and paying her entire tuition balance in cash, watching the administrative assistant's face transform from bored indifference to shocked confusion, seeing the words paid in full stamped and read across her student account that currently showed thousands in red negative numbers, buying actual groceries instead of ramen noodles and day-old bread from the discount rack at the corner store, filling her refrigerator with fresh vegetables and real meat instead of processed substitutes. Maybe even taking a weekend off, sleeping for more than 4 interrupted hours at a time, not waking up with her entire body aching from exhaustion and stress that had become her permanent state of existence. She could quit this soul-crushing diner job immediately, walk out tonight and never smell burnt coffee or mop sticky floors again, focus entirely on her paramedic shifts and her studies, actually have time to excel and learn instead of just barely surviving each day through sheer stubborn will. Tears formed in her eyes as the weight of 4 years of financial struggle became tangible and crushing, pressing down on her shoulders like physical weight, making it hard to breathe. No one would ever know if she took this money. The diner had no security cameras in the dining area, just one broken camera over the cash register that hadn't worked in months. The mysterious man in the expensive suit was long gone, disappeared into the Chicago night. She could take the cash, leave the medical equipment on the counter with an anonymous note, and walk away clean. Her hands trembled violently as she stared at the money through blurring tears, feeling the crushing weight of desperation whispering seductively in her ear that she deserved this, that she'd earned it through sheer survival, that taking it wasn't really stealing. It was cosmic justice for every unfair hardship she'd endured, every double shift, every skip meal, every time she'd chosen between paying rent and buying textbooks. But then, cutting through the desperate rationalization like a knife through fog, she heard her grandmother Ruth's voice as clearly as if the woman were standing beside her in the empty diner, her weather hand on Riley's shoulder. Ruth Mitchell had raised Riley in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the south side after Riley's parents died in a terrible car accident on the Dan Ryan Expressway when Riley was only 7 years old and too young to fully understand permanent loss. Ruth had worked 2 backbreaking jobs her entire adult life, cleaning office buildings at night while business people slept in comfortable beds, and working as a home health aide during the day, bathing and feeding elderly patients for minimum wage and no benefits, never making more than poverty-level income, never complaining about her aching back or swollen feet, never cutting corners or compromising her principles, even when money was so tight they ate beans and rice for weeks. Her grandmother's most repeated lesson, the one she drilled into Riley since childhood with persistence of water-wearing stone, echoed now with painful clarity that made Riley's chest tighten. Baby girl, there's no peace in stolen comfort. You can't sleep soundly on someone else's dime, no matter how much you need it or think you deserve it. Your integrity is the only thing in this world that's truly yours, that nobody can take from you or buy from you. Don't you ever sell it, not for any amount of money, because once it's gone, you can't buy it back. Riley closed her eyes, hot tears sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto her worn uniform, as she carefully, deliberately closed a medical bag with shaking hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. She couldn't take this money, not because she wasn't desperate enough. God knows she was drowning in desperation, but because her grandmother had been absolutely right about the cost of compromised principles. If she took this cash, every single dollar she spent would be haunted by guilt. Every tuition payment would feel dirty and wrong. Every meal would taste like theft and shame. She would know what she'd done, and that knowledge would eat at her forever like acid, destroying the peace Ruth had worked so hard to instill in her. But beyond her grandmother's moral compass that had become her internal North Star, Riley's paramedic training was screaming at her about something equally important. the blood bag labeled with AB negative blood type. AB negative was the rarest blood type in existence, possessed by only 1% of the population, so rare that blood banks constantly struggled to maintain adequate supplies. Someone with that blood type carrying their own personal supply along with a full professional trauma kit wasn't just cautious or overprepared. They were expecting danger, actively preparing for violence, living a life where emergency medical care had to happen in absolute secret, far from hospitals and official records. Someone might desperately need this equipment tonight. Someone could die without it. Riley wiped her tears with the back of her hand, stood up from a booth on legs that felt weak and unsteady, and walked with determined steps toward the counter, carrying the medical bag and the financial freedom she was choosing to give up, choosing integrity over survival, choosing her grandmother's voice over her own desperate needs. Tucked into a slim side pocket of the medical bag that she almost missed, Riley found a minimalist business card, made of thick, expensive cardstock that felt substantial between her fingers. There was no name printed on it, no company title, no logo or branding of any kind. Just a single phone number printed in elegant black font that looked hand-engraved rather than commercially printed. Riley stared at that number for a long moment, her mind racing through her limited options with growing anxiety. She couldn't trust Royal Dennis, her manager. He was a cynical man in his 50s who'd been working at Stella's for 20 grinding years and had perfected the art of looking out for himself first, always taking the largest tips from a communal jar and forgetting to pay back money he borrowed. If she told him about the $75,000, it would disappear into his pocket before she could blink, and he'd probably report the bag stolen to police to cover his tracks and pocket the cash with a clear conscience and a manufactured story. She couldn't just leave it here behind the counter and hope the owner came back. That much cash was too tempting for anyone who worked the morning shift, any of the cooks or servers who were even more desperate than she was. Mailing it to the address that would presumably be on the ID felt too slow and risky for medical equipment that someone might need urgently tonight, right now, for an emergency that couldn't wait for the Postal Service's 3 to 5 business days. No, she had to make direct contact, had to speak to whoever owned this equipment immediately. She walked behind the counter to the old wall-mounted phone that still had a greasy rotary dial that stuck sometimes, picked up the heavy receiver that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and other people's conversations, and carefully dialed a number from the business card with a finger that trembled slightly. It was 2:15 in the morning, an absurd time to call anyone about anything, but the medical equipment suggested this was someone who operated outside normal business hours. The phone rang exactly once before a male voice answered, gruff and demanding, with absolutely zero polite preamble or professional greeting of any kind. Speak. Just that one word, delivered like a command rather than a question. Riley took a shaky breath. Try and project confidence she absolutely didn't feel. Try to sound like a responsible professional rather than a terrified waitress who was in way over her head. Hi, my name is Riley Mitchell. I'm a waitress at Stella's Diner on South Halsted Street. I found a medical emergency kit left in one of our booths. The blood bag inside is labeled with the name A. Wolfe. I wanted to call immediately in case someone needs this equipment urgently. It looks professional and important. The line went completely, utterly silent. It wasn't just a pause in conversation. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that stretched for several uncomfortable seconds, making Riley wonder if the call had disconnected or she'd somehow offended whoever was on the other end by calling at this hour. Then the gruff voice said simply, with no explanation or context, "Hold. Don't hang up." Riley waited, her palms sweating against the phone receiver, listening to complete dead air on the line that made her question whether anyone was still there. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that on the other end of that call, in a luxury penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering city lights like a postcard, Alexander Wolfe had immediately gestured to his head of security with a sharp-hand signal that required no words. Within 30 seconds, his team was running Riley's name through every database they had access to, legal and otherwise, pulling information from sources that ranged from public records to systems that definitely weren't meant for civilian access. Alexander stood at his massive windows, phone pressed his ear, waiting with the infinite patience of Predator as information flooded across his associate's tablet screen in rapid scrolling text. Riley and Mitchell, age 26. His security chief read aloud in a flat professional tone. Current address, 847 South Winchester Avenue, apartment 3B, South Side, high crime area. Currently employed as a certified paramedic, Chicago Fire Department, Station 18. For years, active field experience with specialization in trauma response and emergency medicine. Also employed part-time at Stella's Diner, South Side location. Weekend overnight shifts for supplemental income. No criminal record whatsoever. No outstanding warrants. No arrests. No flags. Credit score 640. Low due to student loan debt totaling $47,000 from paramedic certification program and current part-time enrollment at Chicago City College. Pre-med track. Maintaining a 3.7 GPA despite working approximately 60 hours per week. No red flags. No concerning associations. Clean history. She's exactly what she appears to be, a broke medical student working herself to death. Alexander's gray eyes narrowed with intense interest as he processed this information with the calculating precision of a chess master seeing 3 moves ahead. Not just honest, trained, a certified paramedic with 4 years of trauma experience who could have easily taken $75,000 in untraceable cash and disappeared into the city, but instead chose to call and return at 2 a.m. because of potential medical urgency. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Exactly the kind of person he'd been searching for. Alexander took the phone from his security chief with a smooth motion, his voice transforming instantly from the gruff barrier guard to something deeper, smoother, more authoritative, the voice of a man accustomed to absolute control and immediate obedience from everyone around him. "This is Wolfe. You have my property, Miss Mitchell." It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with chilling certainty designed to establish dominance immediately, to put her on the defensive, to see how she responded to pressure. Riley's breath caught audibly at the sudden shift in tone, at the weight of authority that pressed the phone line like a physical force. "Yes, sir," she managed, keeping her voice as steady as possible despite her racing heart. "You left it in booth 7. It contains surgical equipment, medications, a blood bag with your name, and some cash. I want to call immediately so you could retrieve it. I'm finishing my shift now and can wait if you need to come back." There was a calculated pause, deliberate and measuring, designed to unsettle her. Then Alexander spoke again, his tone deliberately cold and assessing, each word chosen carefully to test a reaction. "You could have kept it, Miss Mitchell. $75,000. You work in a diner and carry student loan debt that's crushing you. I'm fully aware of your financial situation. The casual invasion of her privacy, the fact that he'd somehow learned her entire life story in under 2 minutes, sent a genuine chill down Riley's spine that made her skin prickle. But she refused to let fear show in her voice, refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much he'd rattled her. "It's yours, sir. My financial situation doesn't change that fact. And the blood bag suggests potential medical urgency. Someone might need this equipment tonight. That matters more than money." There was a brief pause, and Riley could almost feel him recalculating, reassessing her, adjusting his opinion based on her response. "You will stay exactly where you are, Miss Mitchell. Do not let that medical kit out of your sight, under any circumstances. Do you understand?" His voice sharpened with command, with the absolute expectation of obedience. Riley's heart was pounding now, genuine fear mixing with confusion. "Understood, sir. A driver will arrive in exactly 15 minutes. You will hand the kit to him directly. You will not attempt to speak to him beyond necessary confirmation. And Miss Mitchell," his voice dropped to a lower, more dangerous register that carried an unmistakable threat, "you opened that bag. You saw the contents. You saw the cash. Do you confirm this?" Riley knew he was testing her, trying to catch her in a lie, asserting power by forcing her to admit her transgression. She made a split-second decision born of pure survival instinct. She lied, gambling that honesty about dishonesty might be more dangerous than a strategic untruth. "The kit remains sealed and untouched since I found it, sir. I only called because it looked medical and urgent. Brief, dangerous silence that seemed to crackle with electricity. Then your honesty or lack thereof will be evaluated thoroughly, Miss Mitchell. Wait there. The line disconnected with a sharp click that sounded final. Riley replaced the phone with shaking hands, her mind reeling from the conversation, from the casual threat in his voice, from the terrifying efficiency with which he'd learned everything about her. 15 agonizing minutes passed, each one stretching like an hour, while Riley sat on a stool behind the counter, clutching the medical kit and jumping at every sound from the street. Then, at exactly 2:30 in the morning with punctuality that felt deliberate and intimidating, a massive black GMC Yukon Denali with tinted windows so dark they looked opaque pulled up directly in front of Stella's diner, its engine idling with quiet, menacing power that seemed to vibrate the plate glass windows. The passenger door opened and a man stepped out who looked like he'd been assembled in a factory that produced professional bodyguards. Tall, at least 6'3", built like someone who spent serious time in a gym with heavy weights, wearing a black turtleneck and an expensive leather coat that shimmered subtly under the streetlights. His face was completely emotionless, expressionless, blank as a mannequin. He moved with heavy, deliberate grace that suggested controlled violence always simmering just below the surface. He pushed open the diner door, and the entry chimes sounded like a warning bell in the silent space. Riley Mitchell, he stated in a flat-bass voice with no inflection whatsoever, not asking a question but confirming an established fact. Yes, Riley replied, standing quickly from the stool, her legs feeling unsteady. She slid the medical kit across the counter toward him. Here it is. Everything should be intact. The man, Tony Marcus, though Riley didn't know his name yet, didn't move immediately. He subjected Riley to a full, invasive visual assessment that made her skin crawl, his eyes scanning her tired face, her worn waitress uniform with its faded logo, her defensive posture with shoulders slightly hunched, searching for any tell, any sign of deception or theft or tampering with the contents, any hint that she was planning some kind of deception or had compromised the integrity of what she was returning. The scrutiny was intense enough to make her want to step backward, to flee. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds, he reached out with thick gloved fingers and picked up the medical kit, tapping it twice against his palm, as if confirming its weight and contents through muscle memory alone, a gesture that suggested intimate familiarity with exactly what should be inside. He slipped it into a large interior pocket of his coat that seemed designed specifically for that purpose. Mr. Wolfe appreciates your promptness and integrity, Tony stated in that same flat, mechanical tone that sounded rehearsed. Then he reached into another pocket and placed a thick manila envelope on the counter where the kid had been, the paper making a solid sound against the formica. His gratitude. Riley shook her head immediately, putting both hands up in instinctive refusal, her body language screaming rejection. I don't need payment. It was the right thing to do. I was just returning something that didn't belong to me. Tony's expression didn't change at all, not even a flicker of emotion crossing his blank features. The directive is not negotiable, Miss Mitchell. Accept the exchange. It closes the transaction. His voice hardened slightly, gaining a subtle edge of authority that suggested arguing would be pointless. He gave a single curt nod, a gesture that seemed to encompass acknowledgement, dismissal, and warning all at once, and turned on his heel, walking out of the diner without another word or backward glance. Less than 30 seconds later, the black SUV pulled away silently into the night, disappearing down Halstead Street like a shadow. Riley stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the empty space where the vehicle had been, her heart still pounding, her hands still trembling. Finally, with movements that felt disconnected from her conscious mind, she reached for the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy, weighted not by papers but by something more substantial. Inside was $5,000 in fresh, sequential bills that smelled like mint and ink, and a handwritten note on expensive cream-colored cardstock in smooth, confident script that looked like it had been written with a fountain pen. The note read, Miss Mitchell, an interesting choice. You prioritize principle over profit in a world that seldom rewards it. Your name is now associated with a trait I require. Do not spend these funds immediately. Do not mention this to anyone. You have passed the preliminary vetting. Wait for contact. A.W. Riley sank slowly onto the stool behind the counter, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight, the note slipping from her fingers onto the counter. Preliminary vetting. The words echoed in her mind with terrifying implications. She hadn't just returned a medical kit to its rightful owner. She had been tested, investigated within minutes, evaluated according to criteria she didn't understand, and cataloged in some system she couldn't comprehend. Alexander Wolfe wasn't a casual businessman or a wealthy eccentric. He was something far more dangerous, someone who operated in shadows where normal rules didn't apply. And this money wasn't a simple reward for good behavior. It was a leash, a down payment, a marker that said he owned a piece of her future now, whether she wanted it or not. She had been claimed by a man whose world operated according to rules she didn't understand. And there was no way to unclaim herself, no way to return to the innocent ignorance of an hour ago. 3 days later, 3:45 a.m., Riley's apartment. The emergency call and the ultimate test. 3 days passed in a blur of paranoid anxiety that colored every moment of Riley's existence. She went through the motions of her life, responding to emergency calls in her ambulance, racing through red lights with sirens wailing toward people bleeding and dying, serving coffee and eggs at the diner with a smile that felt painted on, sitting through her pharmacology lectures, taking notes her brain couldn't retain. But she felt fundamentally changed, like she was walking through her old life wearing someone else's skin that didn't quite fit. She'd hidden the $5,000 in a small lockbox that she then tucked under a loose floorboard in her tiny studio apartment that she'd discovered by accident, unable to spend a single dollar of it despite her desperate need to pay her electric bill that was 2 weeks overdue. The money felt radioactive, dangerous, like it came with invisible strings attached that would tighten around her throat if she tried to use it. She constantly felt watched, assessed, followed by eyes she couldn't see but could feel crawling across her skin. Every black car that drove past her bus stop made her pulse spike with irrational fear. Every customer who looked at her too long in the diner made her wonder if they were one of Alexander Wolfe's people, reporting back on her behavior, her movements, her compliance with his inexplicable instructions. She told absolutely no one about the medical kit, the cash, or the cryptic note that she'd read so many times she had it memorized. How could she possibly explain it to anyone? Her best friend from paramedic school would think she'd lost her mind or got involved with something illegal. Her study group would ask too many questions she couldn't answer without sounding insane. So Riley carried the secret alone, a heavy weight pressing constantly on her chest, making it hard to breathe, making her feel like she was drowning slowly in quicksand. She knew with absolute certainty that Alexander Wolfe wasn't finished with her. The note had explicitly said, "Wait for contact." And Riley understood with growing dread that waiting was part of the test too. Seeing if she would panic, if she would run, if she would spend the money and prove herself untrustworthy, if she would talk to police or friends or anyone. So she waited with mounting anxiety, barely sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch, constantly on edge, her nervous system stuck in fight or flight mode, knowing that when the contact finally came, her life would change forever in ways she couldn't predict but deeply feared. Riley was hunched over her tiny kitchen table at 3:45 in the morning on Monday night, surrounded by anatomy textbooks and a mug of cold coffee that had gone bitter hours ago, trying to force her exhausted brain to memorize the complex branches of the abdominal aorta for an exam in 5 hours that would determine whether she passed or failed her current course. She just finished a brutal 12-hour paramedic shift responding to a horrific 3-car pileup on the Dan Ryan Expressway that had left 2 people dead and 3 more critically injured, their blood still metaphorically on her hands, their screams still echoing in her ears. She had to be at Stella's diner by 10 o'clock that same night for another overnight shift, which meant she'd get maybe 3 hours of sleep, if she was lucky. Her eyes were burning with fatigue, so deep it felt like sandpaper, her entire body aching from too many hours on her feet and too little proper nutrition, when her personal cell phone suddenly rang with shrill tone that shattered the quiet apartment. The number on the screen was one she didn't recognize, just a string of digits that could have been from anywhere. But Riley's heart immediately jumped into her throat because she knew, somehow she just knew with absolute certainty, before she even answered. Her hand trembled as she picked up the phone. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed fear and anticipation. Alexander Wolfe's voice came through the line, and it was completely different from the cold, controlled tone of 3 nights ago when he commanded her to wait and threatened to evaluate her honesty. Now his voice was tight, strained, urgent, almost ragged with barely contained desperation that made him sound almost human. Riley, listen very carefully. A car will be outside your building in exactly 8 minutes. Put on your paramedic uniform immediately. Bring your personal medical bag, if you have one. No questions. No phone calls. No conversation with the driver. The patient is critical, life-threatening, multiple trauma. I need your skills, and I need absolute silence. Do you understand me? Riley was already on her feet before he finished speaking, her paramedic training overriding her fear like a switch being flipped, her mind shifting automatically into emergency response mode. Where are we going? What's the mechanism of injury? She asked, already moving toward her closet where her uniform hung pressed and ready. Alexander's voice cracked slightly, and she heard real emotion bleeding through control for the first time. Outside the city. Secure location. Stab wound. Tony will have the address. Focus, Riley. Someone's life depends on your skill. Do not fail me. The line went dead with a click that sounded final. Riley stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds, her mind racing through trauma protocols and worst-case scenarios, then moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd responded to hundreds of emergencies. She stripped off her study clothes, pulled on her dark Navy Chicago Fire Department paramedic uniform pants and jacket that identified her as official emergency medical personnel, laced her boots with quick, efficient movements, grabbed her personal medical bag that she kept stocked with extra supplies she'd accumulated over 4 years of field work, and was standing outside her apartment building in exactly 7 minutes, her breath forming clouds in the cold pre-dawn air. At 3:53 in the morning, precisely as promised, the same massive black GMC Yukon Denali from 3 nights ago pulled up to the curb in front of Riley's building, its engine purring quietly, its presence both intimidating and surreal in a quiet residential neighborhood where normal people slept in warm beds. Tony Marcus was behind the wheel, his face visible briefly in the streetlight, still expressionless as stone. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Riley beyond a brief glance in the rearview mirror that lasted less than a second. She climbed into the back seat with her medical bag, settling into leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent, her mind already running through trauma protocols with the systematic efficiency she'd learned through years of emergency medicine. Airway, breathing, circulation, hemorrhage control procedures, shock management algorithms, rapid trauma assessment sequences. The drive was long, silent, and increasingly disorienting. They left the city limits within 20 minutes, the bright lights of Chicago fading behind them as they wound through increasingly dark and empty country roads with no streetlights, no houses, no signs of civilization. Riley tried to track their route out of professional habit, watching for landmarks and road signs, but lost orientation after 20 minutes of seemingly random turns through countryside she didn't recognize. Finally, after nearly 45 minutes of driving that took them deep into what felt like rural Illinois, they approached a massive private estate that appeared suddenly out of the darkness like something from a movie. The property was surrounded by 12-foot stone walls that looked medieval and impenetrable, topped with what Riley suspected were sophisticated security measures. Security cameras were mounted every 20 feet along the perimeter, their red lights blinking steadily in the darkness, watching everything with electronic eyes. Heavy iron gates at least 15 feet tall opened automatically as they approached, clearly triggered by some sensor or remote control, and closed immediately behind them with solid, final clang that sounded like a prison door, cutting off any possibility of easy exit. The property beyond the gates was enormous. Riley estimated at least 20 acres of manicured grounds, with a sprawling main house that looked like something from Architectural Digest, all clean modern lines, floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the moonlight, and expensive landscaping with shaped hedges, and what looked like sculpture gardens. The Yukon didn't stop at the main entrance where normal guests would be received. Instead, Tony drove around the side of the house to a hidden entrance that would be invisible from the road, leading down a ramp into an underground parking garage. The garage was pristine and climate-controlled, the air temperature comfortable, and housed at least 6 other luxury vehicles that Riley could see in the dim lighting: a silver Bentley, a black Mercedes S-Class, a white Range Rover, a red Porsche 911, and 2 other SUVs that looked similarly expensive. Tony parked the Yukon in a designated spot, turned off the engine, and finally spoke for the first time since picking her up. "Follow me. Stay close. Do not speak to anyone. Do not touch anything. Understand?" His voice was flat, mechanical, offering no room for questions or negotiation. Riley nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and followed him through a doorway into a series of immaculate corridors with polished marble floors that clicked under her boots and recessed lighting that made everything look like a high-end hotel or corporate office. Tony led Riley through 2 heavy security doors that looked like they belonged in a bank vault, each requiring both keycard access and biometric scanning that verified his fingerprint and retinal pattern before the magnetic locks disengaged with solid mechanical clicks. The level of security made Riley's anxiety spike even higher. Whatever was behind these doors was critically important, critically secret, or both. Finally, they entered a dedicated medical wing that took Riley's breath away with its completeness and obvious expense. It was a fully equipped private trauma bay that rivaled some emergency rooms she'd worked in during her clinical rotations, possibly better equipped than some small rural hospitals. Adjustable surgical lights hung from ceiling-mounted arms, capable of illuminating the smallest details. Comprehensive monitoring equipment lined one wall. Cardiac monitor with 5-lead capability, pulse oximeter, automated blood pressure cuff, capnography for monitoring respiratory function. A crash cart stood ready in the corner, its drawers labeled with emergency medications and a defibrillator mounted on top. Multiple 4 poles on wheeled stands. A locked pharmaceutical cabinet that undoubtedly contained controlled substances. Sterile supply storage with glass-fronted cabinets showing organized instruments and supplies. Even a portable X-ray machine on a wheel base for imaging without moving the patient. Everything was state-of-the-art, clearly maintained by someone with serious medical knowledge and unlimited financial resources. And there, standing in the center of the room beside a gurney, was Alexander Wolfe. He was no longer wearing the expensive charcoal suit from the diner. Now he was dressed in black tactical pants with cargo pockets and a dark, high-collared shirt that fit his frame precisely, both garments spattered with dark, drying blood that had soaked through in places and crusted at the edges. His face was pale, not with fear but with exertion and stress. His jaw clenched so tight, Riley could see the muscle jumping, his gray eyes wild with emotion she had never expected to see in a man like him, raw, desperate fear that bordered on panic barely contained by iron will. On the gurney lay an elderly man, probably early 60s, unconscious, and clearly in serious medical distress. He was dressed in expensive casual clothes, designer slacks and button-down shirt that had been roughly cut away to expose his chest, the fabric scissors mangled and blood-soaked. A blood-soaked pressure dressing covered the left side of his chest near his sternum, and the gauze was already completely saturated, dark blood still seeping through in spreading stains. The man's skin was pale and clammy, covered in a sheen of cold sweat, his lips slightly blue with cyanosis indicating poor oxygenation. His breathing was shallow and labored, his chest barely rising. He was in shock, possibly profound shock, and without immediate intervention he would die. Riley's paramedic training took over instantly, automatically, pushing aside every ounce of fear and confusion like flipping a switch. She dropped her medical bag on a nearby table, moved directly to the gurney without hesitation, and began her rapid assessment without waiting for permission or explanation. Carotid pulses thready and rapid, approximately 120, Riley announced, her fingers pressed firmly against the man's neck, feeling the faint irregular rhythm that spoke of a body struggling to maintain perfusion, her voice steady and professional despite the surreal situation. Respirations are shallow, around 24 per minute. Skin is cool and diaphoretic. He's in hypovolemic shock from significant blood loss. What's the mechanism of injury? How long ago did this happen? Her training made the questions automatic, necessary for proper treatment decisions. Alexander stepped closer, his presence looming, his voice rough and strained with barely suppressed emotion. Blade attack. Approximately 90 minutes ago. Single deep stab wound. Glancing trajectory across the sternum. Looks like it was aimed for the heart, but the angle was off. I applied direct pressure and a compression bandage immediately, but the bleeding won't fully stop. I can't risk a hospital. No police. No records. No questions. This has to stay completely private. Riley was already cutting away the saturated pressure dressing with trauma shears from her bag, her movements practiced and efficient. The wound was immediately visible once she removed the bandage, and it made her breath catch slightly. It was a deep, jagged laceration approximately 4 inches long, running at a diagonal angle across the left chest. The edges ragged where the blade had torn tissue rather than cutting cleanly. The bleeding was venous, steady dark blood welling up continuously, but not the bright red arterial spurting that would have been immediately fatal, which was actually a good sign in terms of immediate survival, but the depth and location were extremely concerning. The wound was dangerously close to major vessels, including the internal mammary artery, and potentially close enough to have damaged the pericardium that surrounded the heart. "I need better light directly overhead," Riley commanded, her voice sharp with professional authority. No longer the frightened waitress, but a trained emergency medical professional taking control. "Start 2 large-bore IVs, 18 gauge if you have them. Normal saline, wide open to replace volume. I need sterile irrigation solution, sterile drapes, a comprehensive suture kit with multiple sizes, and someone to assist me through this procedure. Is anyone else here with medical training?" Alexander moved immediately, his movements surprisingly efficient for someone in obvious emotional distress, adjusting the overhead surgical light to focus directly on the wound and pulling over a well-stocked medical supply cart. His voice was steady despite his obvious emotional turmoil. "Tell me what to do. I'll assist. I've done this before." His hands were steady despite everything, suggesting experience with medical emergencies. Riley looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time since arriving, and saw something she hadn't expected. This powerful, controlled man who radiated dangerous authority was barely holding himself together emotionally, his calm exterior a thin shell over roiling desperation. "Who is he?" she asked quietly, her hands already exploring the wound margins gently, checking for deeper damage to structures beneath the skin. Alexander's jaw tightened visibly, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked with barely suppressed emotion that broke through his careful control. "Riley, this is William Wolfe. My father." Riley's hands paused for just a fraction of a second, processing this revelation and its implications, then continued their skilled assessment because the patient's life took precedence over explanations. "Your father," she repeated quietly, not making a question, just acknowledging the weight of what he'd told her and the emotion behind it. Alexander handed her sterile gloves from a nearby supply pack, his movements mechanical and controlled as if he was operating on autopilot. "He abandoned my mother and me when I was 8 years old. Disappeared completely one night, without any explanation. No goodbye, no note, no contact for 30 years. 3 decades of nothing." His voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone reciting painful facts to avoid actually feeling them. "I found him 3 months ago, purely by accident. We've been attempting reconciliation, trying to rebuild something from nothing. It's been difficult, complicated. We barely know each other. Tonight, someone from my past tried to send me a message by targeting him, by hurting the one person I've allowed myself to care about in years. They wanted to show me I'm vulnerable." He met Riley's eyes, and she saw the complex storm of emotions there, rage at whoever had done this, grief for lost years that could never be recovered, guilt for not protecting William better, and desperate fear of losing him again just when they'd found each other. "I can't let him die, Riley. I don't know if I can forgive him for what he did to us, for abandoning us when I was just a child who needed a father. But I can't let him die like this. Does that make sense?" Riley nodded, her heart breaking for this dangerous man, showing her his deepest wound, revealing vulnerability she'd never expected. "It makes complete sense," she said softly, with genuine compassion. Then her voice shifted back to professional authority, because compassion wouldn't save William's life. "The blood bag in your medical kit, AB negative blood type. That's him." Alexander confirmed with a tight nod. "It's both of us. We share the rare blood type, one of the only things we share." He was a trauma surgeon before he left, worked in emergency rooms, saving lives. That kit I left at the diner was his old emergency kit from his surgical days. I kept it all these years without really knowing why. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Maybe I was waiting for this moment. Maybe some part of me knew I'd need it someday. Riley's mind was racing through medical calculations and resource limitations. We can't do a transfusion here safely without proper blood banking and cross-matching procedures, but the saline will help stabilize his blood pressure temporarily by replacing lost volume. The primary threat right now is continued hemorrhage and potential infection from contamination. I need you to follow my instructions exactly. Can you do that without hesitation? Alexander nodded, his face set with fierce determination. Tell me what you need. I won't fail him. For the next 2 hours and 17 minutes that felt simultaneously endless and impossibly fast, Riley worked with intense, focused precision that drew on every bit of her paramedic training and emergency trauma experience accumulated over 4 years of working Chicago's most violent streets. She irrigated the wound thoroughly with sterile saline, carefully flushing away blood clots and potential contaminants, then carefully explored the depth of the laceration with a gloved finger, checking for deeper vascular or organ damage that would require immediate intervention beyond her capabilities. The blade had miraculously missed the internal mammary artery by less than a centimeter, a fraction of an inch closer, and William would have bled out before they could have gotten him here, would have died in whatever location he was attacked. Riley checked repeatedly for signs of pneumothorax by listening to lung sounds and watching chest wall movement, and for signs of cardiac tamponade by monitoring heart sounds and neck veins, but found none. It was a devastating, life-threatening injury, but was survivable with proper care. She worked methodically through the layered closure, starting with deep interrupted sutures, using absorbable material to close the muscle and facial layers, ensuring proper approximation of tissue planes to minimize dead space where fluid could accumulate. Then she performed a meticulous running subcuticular closure for the skin, using fine monofilament suture, each stitch placed with the obsessive care of someone who understood that precision mattered, that this man's life and his son's sanity depended on her skill and attention to detail. Alexander stood beside her the entire time, his presence a steady, silent weight that was somehow reassuring despite the circumstances. He managed the 4 bags with practiced efficiency, adjusting flow rates when she called for changes, monitored William's vital signs on the bedside monitor, and called out numbers when she asked, and handed Riley instruments before she had to ask for them, anticipating her needs with almost uncanny accuracy. His movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting he'd clearly done this before, assisted in emergency medical procedures in circumstances that couldn't involve official channels or government oversight. The air in the medical wing was thick with the smell of blood, antiseptic, and concentrated tension that made breathing feel difficult. Riley's back ached from bending over the gurney for so long, her neck cramping from maintaining the awkward angle. Her hands were steady, but her shoulders trembled with fatigue and adrenaline that was slowly draining from her system. When she finally tied off the last suture with surgeon's knot, applied a clean, sterile pressure dressing over closed wound, and secured the 4-line with fresh tape, she stepped back and let out a long, shaky breath that she'd been holding unconsciously. "He's stable," Riley announced, her voice slightly hoarse from 2 hours of minimal speaking, except to give terse medical instructions. She stripped off her blood-soaked gloves that were stained dark red, dropping them in a nearby medical waste container, and looked at the monitor displaying William's vital signs with critical assessment. "Heart rate is down to 98 from 120 when we started. That's good improvement. Blood pressure is 105/68. Still low, but improving steadily with the fluid resuscitation. Oxygen saturation is 94% on room air, which is acceptable. The bleeding is completely controlled with no signs of reaccumulation. The wound is closed and dressed appropriately." She turned to face Alexander directly, needing him to understand the full picture. "But Alexander, you need to understand, he's not out of danger yet. The biggest threat now is infection from bacterial contamination of the wound. He needs broad-spectrum 4 antibiotics starting immediately and continuing for at least 5 days. He needs continuous monitoring for the next 48 hours minimum. That means checking vital signs every 2 hours, monitoring the wound site for increased redness, warmth, swelling, or drainage, watching for fever or changes in mental status. Any signs of systemic infection, and we're dealing with potentially life-threatening complication that would require hospitalization despite your preference for privacy. He cannot be moved during this critical period. Movement could disrupt the closure or cause rebleeding. Alexander stood perfectly still, staring down at his unconscious father with an expression of such complex emotion that Riley felt like she was witnessing something deeply private. His chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths as if he'd been holding himself together through sheer force of will for hours and could finally allow himself to feel something other than fear and desperate focus. He closed his eyes for a long moment, and Riley saw his throat work as he swallowed hard, fighting emotion. When he opened his eyes and looked at her, the expression that was something she'd never seen before in anyone's eyes, raw, intense gratitude mixed with something deeper, something almost like wonder or reverence. "You didn't hesitate," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion that made it rough. "You walked into a stranger's compound in the middle of the night, no questions asked. You saw blood, a critical patient, a situation that was clearly outside the law and probably dangerous. And you didn't hesitate. You didn't ask what this was about. You didn't judge me or him. You just worked. You were focused, professional, absolutely flawless under pressure. You saved his life. Riley, you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." He took a step closer to her, his imposing height making her look up to meet his eyes. Then he did something completely unexpected that made her breath catch. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. The touch was careful, respectful, warm through her uniform, breaking through his cold exterior in a way that felt monumentally significant. "Thank you." The words were simple but loaded with meaning, with emotion, with something that felt like the beginning of a connection she didn't fully understand yet. Alexander arranged for Riley to stay in a luxurious guest suite on the second floor of the main house, a room that was bigger than her entire studio apartment, with a king-size bed that felt like sleeping on clouds and a private bathroom with heated floors. He gave her explicit instructions to check William's vital signs and wound status every 4 hours without fail. A private security guard was posted outside William's recovery room with instructions to summon Riley immediately if anything changed, if the monitors alarmed, if William showed any signs of distress. Riley dozed fitfully between checks, her body utterly exhausted but her mind unable to fully rest, the adrenaline from the surgery still humming through her system like electricity. She would drift into light sleep and then jolt awake, disoriented in the unfamiliar luxury, her paramedic instincts screaming that she needed to check on her patient. On her third check, around 11 in the morning when sunlight was streaming through the windows, nearly 8 hours after surgery, Riley was adjusting William's flow rate and checking his wound dressing for any signs of bleeding or drainage when his eyes suddenly fluttered open. They were gray, exactly like Alexander's, but softer somehow, whether with age and pain and years of regret. He was weak, clearly disoriented, his breathing still shallow but improved from the crisis state he'd been in hours ago. Riley immediately moved closer, her professional mask sliding into place automatically. "Mr. Wolfe, my name is Riley. I'm a paramedic. You were stabbed. You're safe now. You're in a secure location. Your son brought me here to treat you. Try not to move. You have sutures, and any movement could disrupt them." William's eyes focused on her face with visible effort, struggling to process the information through pain and medication. His lips moved, forming words that came out as barely more than a whisper, rough and strained. "Alexander, where?" Riley immediately reassured him, her voice gentle. "He's here. He's been checking on you every hour. He hasn't left the house. He's the one who saved you. He got you here and stopped the worst of the bleeding with direct pressure. I just closed the wound." William's eyes filled with tears that spilled down his weathered cheeks, his face contorted with emotion that looked like it had been held inside for decades. His hand moved slightly, reaching for Riley's with surprising desperation for someone so weak, seeking human connection. Riley took his hand gently, careful not to disturb the 4-line running into his arm. William's grip was weak but insistent, trembling. "Tell him." William's voice cracked, each word clearly painful to form, each syllable an effort. "Tell Alexander the first didn't abandon him. Please. They were coming. Dangerous people from my past. They threatened him and his mother. said they'd kill them both to get to me. I left to protect them. It was the only way to keep them alive, to draw the danger away. I've watched him from a distance for 30 years. Every achievement, every step, every success. I never stopped loving my son. I just couldn't be near him without putting him in danger. The people I owed wouldn't hesitate to hurt a child. Please tell him the truth. Please. He needs to know I didn't just walk away because I didn't care. Riley's eyes filled with tears as she understood the full tragedy of what had happened. The horrible choice William had been forced to make. The sacrifice of 30 years. I'll tell him. I promise. I'll tell him everything. William's eyes closed again, exhausted by the effort of speaking. But there was peace on his face now, a relaxation of tension that suggested relief at finally being able to share the truth after decades of carrying it alone. Riley told Alexander his father's confession that same evening, finding him in the medical wing staring at the monitors that showed William's improving vital signs. She relayed William's words exactly as they'd been spoken, watching his 30 years of pain, abandonment, and carefully constructed emotional armor cracked and fell away from Alexander Wolfe's face like a mask shattering. His eyes glistened with tears that he didn't try to hide, didn't try to suppress. His jaw trembled as he processed a revelation, understanding flooding through him and rewriting his entire childhood, his entire understanding of his father's disappearance. He wept. This powerful, dangerous man who controlled an empire built on fear and violence stood in his private medical wing, with tears streaming down his face as Riley explained that his father's disappearance had been an act of desperate, sacrificial love, not cruel abandonment or indifference. Alexander sat with William for 3 days straight as his father slowly recovered consciousness and strength, and Riley witnessed their quiet, painful reconciliation. Two gray-eyed men finding their way back to each other through halting conversations, shared silences, careful touches, and finally, tears and forgiveness. When William was strong enough to speak at length, propped up on pillows with color returning to his face, he told them everything. The gambling debts to violent organized crime figures, the escalating threats against 8-year-old Alexander and his mother, the impossible choice between staying and watching his family be destroyed or disappearing, and keeping them safe from a distance for the rest of his life. The decades of watching Alexander grow up through private investigators and distant observation. Alexander listened to every word, asked questions, cried, and ultimately forgave, understanding that his father's absence had been the greatest sacrifice a parent could make. A week later, when William was stable enough to move around with assistance, Alexander handed Riley a formal letter and a check that made her gasp. The letter was from Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country, confirming her acceptance to their MD program with a full scholarship covering tuition, books, fees, and living expenses for all 4 years, plus guaranteed funding for her residency training afterward. Every penny paid, Alexander said simply, his voice steady. You graduate debt-free. No loans. No interest. No strings except the ones already established. That was our deal. But that wasn't the end of Riley and Alexander's story. It was just the beginning. Over the following 4 years, as Riley progressed through medical school with straight A's and top clinical evaluations, Alexander called on her occasionally for exactly what he promised: discreet medical consultations for associates who couldn't risk hospitals, emergency treatments that required absolute silence and left no official records, exactly as he'd indicated that first night. But something else happened during those years, something neither of them had planned or anticipated, something that grew slowly and organically like a plant breaking through concrete. Riley saw beyond the dangerous crime boss to the wounded boy who'd lost his father twice and carried that abandonment like a scar on his soul. Alexander saw beyond the skilled paramedic to the woman whose integrity and compassion had given him back something he thought was permanently broken, who'd saved not just his father's life, but his own ability to love and trust. Somewhere between late-night emergency calls and quiet conversations in his medical wing, somewhere between shared coffee at dawn and watching William's continued recovery, respect became trust, trust became friendship, and friendship became something neither of them knew how to name, but both felt deeply and undeniably. 2 years after Riley graduated with her MD, debt-free as promised, with honors and multiple job offers from prestigious hospitals, Alexander Wolfe did something no one who knew him thought possible. He proposed marriage, not with grand gestures or public displays, but privately in the medical wing where they'd first worked together, where she'd save his father and change his life. Riley said yes without hesitation. They married quietly in a private ceremony with only William present as witness. The father whose life had brought them together, the father Alexander had now fully forgiven and built a close relationship with. And then Alexander did something even more impossible. He walked away from his criminal empire entirely. He liquidated his underground operation, severed every criminal connection, paid off obligations, and reinvented himself completely as a legitimate businessman. For 15 years, Alexander Wolfe had operated in the shadows as a high-end fixer, the man wealthy and powerful people called when they had problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels, providing corporate espionage, sensitive debt collection, and protection for clients who paid premium prices for absolute discretion. He'd built a multi-million-dollar empire, providing security and enforcement that often resulted in injuries requiring medical care outside official channels, which was why he'd maintained that fully equipped medical wing and kept his father's old trauma kit, never knowing he'd one day needed to save William's life. But after marrying Riley, he walked away from all of it. He founded Wolfe Security Consulting, a completely legitimate firm that advised Fortune 500 companies on executive protection and corporate security, using his skills and experience for legal purposes. More importantly, he used his accumulated wealth to establish the Wolfe Foundation, funding free medical clinics in Chicago's most underserved communities, the same neighborhoods his former life had sometimes exploited or ignored. It was Riley's idea, her influence, her belief that he could use his resources to heal instead of harm, to give back instead of taking. The transformation wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. It required walking away from power, from fear-based respect, from the adrenaline of operating outside normal rules. But with Riley beside him, challenging him daily, believing in his capacity for change, showing him through her own example what integrity looked like in practice, Alexander Wolfe became a man he was always meant to be. 4 years into their marriage, Dr. Riley Wolfe stood in the surgical wing of Chicago Memorial Hospital, her white coat embroidered with her new name that still made her smile when she saw it. She'd achieved her dream. She was saving lives in a real operating room, leading trauma teams, making life-or-death decisions with confidence earned through years of intense training. But her greatest achievement wasn't her medical degree or her growing reputation as an excellent surgeon. It was visible in the hospital cafeteria where she found Alexander during her lunch break, sitting in a corner booth with their 6-month-old daughter Emma Ruth Wolfe, named for both their father's redemption and Riley's grandmother's unwavering integrity. Alexander held their daughter with the same careful precision he'd once used to command fear, his gray eyes soft as Emma grabbed his finger with her tiny hand and babbled happily, reaching for his face with chubby fingers. William visited twice a week now, a devoted grandfather making up for lost time, teaching Emma silly songs and telling stories about Alexander as a boy, their relationship fully healed and thriving. Riley slid into booth beside her husband, and Alexander looked up at her with an expression that still took her breath away even after years together. Absolute love, deep gratitude, and wonder that she'd chosen him, saved him, transformed him. "How was surgery?" he asked softly, shifting Emma so Riley could hold their daughter, feel her warm weight, smell that perfect baby smell. "Saved 2 lives this morning," Riley replied, kissing Emma's soft head, breathing in the miracle of her existence. 3-car accident on the expressway. Both patients critical when they arrived, both stable now and expected to make full recoveries. Alexander smiled, that rare, genuine smile he only showed his family, the smile that transformed his face from intimidating to beautiful. "You've always been good at saving lives, Dr. Wolfe." Riley looked at her husband, the man she'd met at 2 in the morning in a greasy diner when she returned a medical kit and $75,000 she desperately needed, the man who tested her integrity and found it unbreakable, the man she'd witnessed break and heal and transform into someone completely different. "So have you," she said quietly, meaning it absolutely. Because Alexander hadn't just funded her dreams and paid for her education. He'd proven that redemption was truly possible, that people could fundamentally change, that love could transform darkness into light and violence into healing. She hadn't just saved William Wolfe's life that desperate night. She'd saved Alexander's soul. And in return, he'd given her everything. Not just a medical degree and financial security, but love built on a foundation of one honest choice made in a moment of desperate temptation. A family built on integrity, sacrifice, and a belief that people deserve second chances. Emma babbled happily, her tiny hand reaching for Riley's stethoscope, and Riley understood with perfect clarity. Her journey from struggling paramedic working 2 crushing jobs to the woman who healed not just bodies, but broken hearts and damaged souls had truly begun that night at Stella's Diner. And every choice since, the terrifying surgeries in Alexander's medical wing, the moral compromises she'd made, the leap of faith into love with a dangerous man, had led her here to this perfect moment, holding her daughter while sitting beside the man who'd once been Chicago's most feared enforcer and was now simply hers. Her husband, her family, her redemption story, written in blood, stitches, and unwavering love.